I came home early that Thursday, something I rarely did. The office felt suffocating that afternoon. Endless meetings about quarterly projections, expansion plans, the usual weight of keeping an empire moving. I told my assistant I needed air, needed to clear my head. What I really needed was to escape the constant demands for 30 seconds. The house was quiet when I arrived, too quiet. That should have told me something was already wrong. I heard the sound coming from the kitchen, running water, the faint clink of bottles. My mother had been sick for weeks by that point. Nothing serious, or so I'd been told. Just a persistent weakness, some inflammation in her joints, a general sense of malaise that she attributed to getting older. Angel had volunteered to manage her medications, to make sure everything was taken on schedule. Angel, my wife's sister. She'd been around constantly, always finding reasons to visit, always positioning herself as the helpful one, the caring one. I walked toward the kitchen, still in my suit jacket, my tie loose around my neck. That's when I saw Clara. My wife was standing at the sink with her back to me, and she was pouring something down the drain. Not water, pills. Medication bottles were lined up on the counter beside her, and she was systematically emptying them. White capsules, round tablets, all of it swirling down into nothing. "What are you doing?" I said it before I'd processed what I was actually seeing. Clara turned so fast, she nearly lost her balance. Her face went completely white, not the pale of guilt, the white of absolute shock. "Clinton, those are my mother's medications." I heard my voice rise. I could feel the anger climbing up my chest like something alive. "My mother, Clara, why are you throwing away her medication?" "Because they're not," she started toward me, her hands up in that way she had when she was trying to explain something, that slightly desperate gesture. "You don't understand. They're not her real medication. They're what? You're poisoning her? Is that what this is? My mother is upstairs weak and sick, and you're down here destroying her medication." I didn't let her finish. I couldn't. The anger had taken over completely, and it made sense in a way that her stammering explanations couldn't compete with. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my mind already moving toward consequences. "Clinton, please," she was following me. "Clinton, please just listen for 1 second." But I was already calling for the household staff, already raising my voice so that everyone would know something terrible had happened in our home. By the time my mother's doctor arrived, by the time Angel came rushing in with concern perfectly arranged on her face, by the time the house had filled with people whose opinions would matter far more than my wife's desperate attempts at explanation, Clara had already been written into the role of villain, and I had cast her there without once considering that I might be wrong. Before I continue, I want to reach out to you directly. If you're following along with this story, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to Pressify Stories. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Like this video, let me know you're here, that this matters to you, and comment. Tell me your country. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me you're here. Because this story isn't just mine. It's about all of us. About the moments we choose not to listen. About the people we hurt without meaning to. About the second chances we might give if we had the courage. Now, let's continue. That was 6 years ago. 6 years, and I'm only now beginning to understand the true weight of what happened in that kitchen, and more importantly, what I chose not to see. My family comes from the kind of wealth that insulates you from most consequences. My father built a company that touches every major city in this region. Warehouses, shipping routes, real estate developments. When he died, I inherited not just the business, but the entire apparatus of people who existed to support it. Accountants, lawyers, advisors, people whose job it was to make sure Clinton Douglas remained on top of whatever pile he was standing on. What I didn't inherit was wisdom. What I didn't inherit was the ability to see the people closest to me clearly. I met Clara at a charity event. She was there with her parents, not quite the same social stratum as my family, but close enough. Rich enough that she could move through those spaces without seeming entirely out of place. She had this quality of seeming almost apologetic for her own presence, like she was constantly worried she was taking up too much space, talking too much, being too much of something. I thought it was charming. I thought it meant she was kind. What it actually meant was that she'd learned early to make herself small, to prioritize other people's comfort over her own voice. That's a much less charming quality when you really think about it. It's actually kind of tragic, but I didn't think about it much. She was beautiful in that particular way that made my mother happy. Pale skin, quiet voice, the kind of woman other people's mothers approved of. We dated for 18 months. I proposed at a restaurant where the menu didn't have prices. She said yes. We got married in a ceremony that cost more than most people's houses. For the first year, everything was fine. She decorated the house tastefully. She attended the right events. She didn't embarrass me. She seemed content to exist in the margins of my life while I focused on what actually mattered: the business, the deals, the constant forward momentum of building something bigger. But there were also other people in that house. My mother had moved in with us after my father's death. She was grieving and alone in the enormous family estate, and it made sense for her to come live with us. That's what you do. You take care of your parents. And then there was Angel. Angel was Clara's sister, though you wouldn't know it to look at them. Where Clara was pale and quiet, Angel was vivid. Dark hair, dark eyes, the kind of person who seemed to fill rooms without trying. She had this quality of brightness that made people want to be near her, to bask in her attention. She was magnetic in a way that Clara simply wasn't. I remember the first time Angel came to the house after we were married. She brought flowers and a cake she'd made herself, and asked 1,000 questions about the wedding, about my work, about my mother. She laughed at my jokes. She remembered details I'd mentioned in passing. She made me feel like I was the most interesting person she'd ever met. Clara watched the whole thing with that expression she had, vaguely apologetic, like her sister's brightness was somehow her fault. I didn't think much about it at the time. Within a few months, Angel was at the house constantly. She had this story about her own life that made her visits seem necessary rather than intrusive. Her job was demanding. Her apartment was being renovated. Her boyfriend had just broken up with her. There was always a reason she needed to be there, always a reason why my wife's sister should be taking up space in my home. My mother loved her. That's what I remember most clearly. My mother, who could be exacting and difficult, who demanded proper behavior and attention to detail, who had that particular coldness that comes from being replaced in a man's life. My mother adored Angel. She'd sit in the living room with Angel for hours. Angel would bring her tea, arrange the pillows behind her back, listen to her stories about my father, about the old days, about the way things used to be. Angel would nod at the right moments. She'd ask the right questions. She'd make my mother feel seen in a way that I, her own son, often failed to do. I was busy. I told myself that was the reason I wasn't sitting with my mother for hours. I was building something. The company needed me. There were decisions only I could make. These were all true things. They were also, I now understand, excuses for not doing the harder work of actually being present for the people who depended on me. Angel filled that space. And looking back, I think that was always the point. My mother got sick sometime in the middle of year 2. Nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue, aching joints, a general sense of malaise that she attributed to getting older. The doctor prescribed anti-inflammatory medications, something for pain management, supplements for energy. Nothing serious, nothing that required constant monitoring. Angel immediately volunteered to manage the medications. "I'm here so much anyway," she said. "It's no trouble. I'll make sure she takes everything on schedule, keep track of side effects, make notes for the doctor." I thought this was considerate. I said yes without really thinking about it. Looking back, I can see how perfectly this fit into whatever plan was already in motion. But at the time, I just saw a woman being kind to my aging mother. I saw one less thing I had to worry about. I saw something that allowed me to keep my attention on what seemed important. Clara started acting strange around the same time. She'd watch Angel with my mother with this intensity that seemed almost suspicious. I remember asking her about it once. "Why do you look at your sister like that?" And she'd just shake her head and say nothing was wrong. She seemed distracted, pulled inward, in a way that made the house feel colder somehow. I assumed it was jealousy. I assumed Clara was upset that my mother had bonded with Angel more quickly than she'd bonded with her own wife. I remember thinking, not unkindly but definitely not gently, that Clara needed to be less sensitive about these things, that my mother had her own preferences, and Clara couldn't control that. I never asked myself why Clara seemed to be withdrawing further, why she was spending more time alone, why she'd started this habit of watching what everyone else was doing with an intensity that suggested she was trying to solve a problem only she could see. A month into Angel's medication management, my mother had gotten worse, not better. She was weaker, more confused sometimes. There were moments where she'd lose her train of thought mid-sentence, which had never happened before. Her hands would shake when she tried to hold a cup of tea. The inflammation in her joints, which the medication was supposed to be reducing, seemed to be getting worse instead. Angel was concerned about this. She'd bring it up in these conversations that somehow always happened when I was present. "I'm worried about how she's responding to the anti-inflammatories," she'd say. "Do you think we should adjust the dosage? I'm so afraid she's getting worse, not better. I hate seeing her suffer like this." I'd agree that yes, we should probably have the doctor adjust things. I'd suggest more tests, more monitoring, and then I'd go back to work because there was always something at work that needed my attention more urgently than my aging mother's mysterious decline. Clara, meanwhile, had developed this strange behavior. She'd hover near my mother's medication bottles. She'd pick them up and examine the labels. Once I walked in on her holding one of the bottles up to the light like she was trying to see inside it. I asked her what she was doing, and she just said she was being careful, making sure the labels were accurate. "Of course they're accurate," I said. "Angel's managing them." Clara looked at me for a long moment, then she said very quietly, "I know." There was something in the way she said it that I should have paid attention to. Some kind of warning maybe, or a last attempt to communicate something important. But I was impatient. I was tired. I had a conference call in 5 minutes, and I didn't have the mental space to figure out what my wife was trying to say to me. I just told her not to worry and left the room. A month later, my mother was visibly deteriorating. She'd lost weight. Her skin had taken on this grayish tone. She'd stopped coming down for meals. When I'd visit her in her room, visits I was making less frequently because I was busy, because she seemed to want Angel's company more than mine, because it was easier to pretend she was just being a difficult old person than to actually confront the reality that something was very wrong. She'd sometimes not recognize me immediately. The doctor said they couldn't find anything specific causing her decline. All the tests came back normal. It was as if her body was simply shutting down from the inside, like someone had dimmed a light that couldn't be brightened again. Angel was devastated by this. She'd sit beside my mother's bed with tears streaming down her face, talking about how much she loved her, how she couldn't bear to see her suffer. She'd hold my mother's hand for hours. She'd bring her soup she'd made herself, try to convince her to eat, to take her medication, to keep fighting. My mother would sometimes reach out and touch Angel's face, the way you'd touch someone you love deeply. I remember watching this and thinking that Angel was the only one who truly cared, who was truly present, who was willing to sit with my mother's suffering instead of pretending it wasn't happening. I remember feeling a kind of gratitude toward her for that, and a kind of resentment toward Clara for not being able to summon that same devotion. Clara had become almost invisible by this point. She'd moved through the house quietly, preparing meals that no one ate, arranging flowers that no one noticed, existing in that apologetic way she had where her presence barely registered as a disturbance to anyone else's life. I didn't miss her. I didn't really see her at all. Then came that Thursday afternoon. I came home early because the office felt suffocating, because I needed to escape the weight of decisions and expectations. The house was quiet in that way it had become, with everyone either in their rooms or absent entirely, and I heard the sound of running water from the kitchen. I found Clara at the sink, and she was pouring out medication. In that moment, before she could say anything, before she could explain, my mind completed a circuit that had been building for months. Clara was poisoning my mother. Clara was jealous of Angel. Clara had been watching, plotting, waiting for her moment. Clara had decided that if she couldn't have my mother's affection, then no one could. It was a story that fit perfectly into the narrative I'd already been constructing, the narrative where Angel was the devoted one, where Clara was the jealous wife, where my mother was suffering because of some flaw in my wife's character that I'd somehow missed. All the other evidence pointed somewhere else, but I didn't see it because I wasn't looking. I was looking for confirmation of the story I'd already decided was true. I called for the household staff. I called for the doctor. I called for my mother. By the time Angel arrived with perfect tears and perfect concern, the machinery of judgment was already in motion, and there was no force in the world that could stop it. Clara tried to explain. I remember her voice, desperate and shaking. "They're not her medication. They're not the right medication. Someone switched them out. Someone is—" But by then there were too many people listening. There was my mother's doctor, looking grave and concerned. There were the household staff, shocked and scandalized. And there was Angel, stepping forward with this expression of terrible sadness, like she had finally decided to say something she'd been holding back. "I didn't want to believe it," Angel said. "I kept hoping I was wrong, but I've been noticing things that made me worry about your wife's state of mind. I think she might have a problem with medication herself. I think she might have been stealing pills, substituting them. Clinton, I'm so sorry, but I think your wife has been trying to hurt your mother." And just like that, the entire story flipped. What had been Clara's desperate attempt to save my mother became, in the eyes of everyone in that room, evidence of her guilt. My mother looked at Clara with this expression of betrayal. My mother, who had just hours earlier been holding Angel's hand, who had just experienced yet another day of mysterious suffering while being cared for by someone she trusted. My mother looked at Clara like she'd never really known her at all, and I looked at my wife, at this woman I'd married who'd tried to tell me something was wrong, who'd been watching and worrying while I was pretending everything was fine, and I made a choice. I told her to leave, not dramatically, not with a lot of anger in that moment, though there would be anger later. In that moment, I was cold. I was the CEO of a major company, and I was treating my wife like a problem that needed to be removed from the premises. I told her to pack a bag and get out. I told her I'd have my lawyer contact her about the separation. I told her that I didn't want to see her in this house again. She kept trying to talk, kept trying to make me understand that she'd been trying to help, that she'd discovered something wrong with the medication, that she wasn't the one poisoning my mother. But there were too many people watching. There was too much momentum behind the story that had already been set in motion. She left that night. I remember watching from the window as she put a bag in her car, just one bag, as if she was hoping this was temporary, as if she thought that I'd realize the truth and ask her to come back. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the car door handle. I remember thinking that I'd done the right thing, that I'd protected my mother, that I'd made the difficult but necessary decision that a responsible son and husband should make. I was wrong about all of it. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice that my mother wasn't getting better. This should have been the first sign that something was still wrong, that the problem hadn't been solved by removing Clara from the house. But instead of recognizing this, I reconstructed the narrative once again. I decided that my mother's poor health was the result of the stress of what had happened, of knowing that her daughter-in-law had betrayed her, of the shock of having her trust violated so completely. I had my lawyers draw up divorce papers. They were thorough and ruthless, designed to punish Clara for what I believed she'd done. I told myself I was protecting myself, but the truth was that I was protecting my pride. I was protecting the story I'd decided was true. And Angel settled into her new position in my life with remarkable ease. She stopped being the visiting sister and became something else entirely. She became the woman who was always there, who was always helpful, who was always positioned just close enough to be indispensable. She helped me with business decisions. She offered opinions on my mother's care. She gradually became the person I consulted on things that I'd once consulted Clara about. Within a few months, it became clear that Angel had never actually been interested in my wife at all, or rather, she'd been interested in replacing her. By the end of that year, we were married. I'm not proud of how quickly it happened. I'm not proud of any of it, to be honest. But at the time, it seemed like the natural order of things. Clara had betrayed me. Angel had been loyal. Angel had been there. The logic was simple and felt absolutely correct. What I didn't notice was that my mother continued to decline. What I didn't notice was that the medication Angel gave her seemed to have no effect whatsoever. What I didn't notice was that my mother had begun to lose coherence, to lose weight, to lose the essential spark of the person she'd been. What I didn't notice was that Angel's behavior toward my mother had shifted completely. Where once she'd been devoted, now she was perfunctory. She'd give my mother her medication with less care, less attention. She'd shorten her visits. She'd sometimes forget to check on her for hours at a time. And when I'd mention this, when I'd point out that my mother seemed to be getting worse instead of better, Angel would look at me with something like pity and say, "Your mother is old, Clinton. Sometimes people just get old and they don't recover. You have to accept that." I accepted it. I accepted all of it because it was easier than asking the questions that were starting to form in the back of my mind. Questions like, why isn't my mother improving? Why does Angel seem less invested in her care now than she was before? Why do I sometimes catch Angel looking at my mother with an expression that isn't quite contempt, but isn't quite anything kind either? These questions scared me because they implied that I'd made a terrible mistake. They implied that I'd ejected my wife from my life based on a lie. They implied that I'd been used, manipulated, made a fool of. So I didn't ask them. I pushed them down. I focused on my work. I told myself that I was doing the right thing, that my mother was simply old, that sometimes life was just sad, and there wasn't anything you could do about it. My mother passed away 18 months after Clara left the house. She went peacefully, in her sleep, which everyone said was a blessing. There was no drawn-out suffering, no hospitals, no machines, just an old woman who went to sleep and didn't wake up. At the funeral, Angel was impeccable. She wore black that made her look elegant and tragic. She cried at exactly the right moments, not so much that it seemed performative, but enough that it was clear how much she'd cared. She accepted condolences with grace. She told people how much my mother had meant to her. I watched her and felt absolutely nothing. That should have been my first real clue that something was wrong. that I could watch my wife perform grief for my mother and feel absolutely nothing should have told me something was deeply out of alignment. But I was numb. I'd been numb for a long time by that point. After the funeral, things changed in the house. Angel became less interested in maintaining the appearance of being a loving daughter-in-law. She'd always been pushing for me to make changes to my will, to ensure that she was taken care of. She'd started subtly criticizing my mother before her death. Nothing obvious, just small comments about her confusion, her neediness, the burden of caring for her. With my mother gone, Angel pivoted. She became focused on the business, on my decision-making, on gradually inserting herself into every aspect of my life and work. She became pregnant about 6 months after my mother's death. I was surprised. We'd talked about having children eventually, but not immediately. But Angel seemed delighted, and I didn't have the energy to question it. I was in my own fog, going through the motions of my life without really being present for any of it. She gave birth to a son. I held him in the hospital and felt this strange disconnection from the moment, like I was watching myself from somewhere outside my body. This was my child. This should have mattered more than anything else in the world. But all I could think was that this child would have a mother who would teach him to lie, to manipulate, to see other people as obstacles to be removed. I never said this out loud. I just held my son and felt the weight of all the mistakes I'd made, all the things I hadn't wanted to see, all the ways I'd failed the people who mattered most. During this time, Clara had disappeared from my life entirely. The divorce had been finalized. She'd taken the settlement I'd given her, which was generous by normal standards but insulting given what I believed she'd done, and vanished. I had no idea where she went or what happened to her. I didn't look. I didn't want to know. Knowing would have required me to confront the possibility that I'd been wrong, and I wasn't ready for that. Years passed. I focused on my work, on my company, on the things I could control. I was a decent father to my son, though I was also a distant one. I was a dutiful husband to Angel, though I was also a disconnected one. I existed in a state of emotional suspension, going through the motions without really being alive. And then, one day, everything changed. My brother had moved back into the family compound years earlier. This was the extended family situation that had always existed, where multiple generations and related families lived in close proximity. He'd had his own struggles, his own demons, his own reasons for needing to return to the safety of the family's money and resources. I didn't know my brother very well. We'd grown up in the same house, but with the distance that comes from having different mothers, different stakes in my father's legacy. He'd made some bad choices, business failures, relationships that had ended badly, money problems that our family had quietly solved. One evening, there was a confrontation between my brother Roy and Angel in the living room. I was passing through, going from one room to another, and I heard raised voices. I almost didn't stop. But something made me pause and listen. "You promised," my brother was saying. "You said once she was out of the way, once you had control of Clinton, you'd make sure I was taken care of. You said we were in this together." And Angel, her voice cold, in a way I'd never heard before. That was before I realized how much easier it was to work alone. "You're a liability, Roy. You always have been. Clinton doesn't even like you. Why should I waste my time keeping you happy?" There was a silence, and then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away, my brother said, "The boy isn't his." I heard that. I heard those words very clearly, and instead of the shock I should have felt, instead of the outrage, I felt something that might have been relief. The piece of the puzzle that had never quite fit suddenly, impossibly, made sense. The boy wasn't mine. Angel had trapped me. Angel had used me. Angel had convinced me to destroy my marriage to a woman I'd never actually given a chance to explain herself, all so that she could have access to my money, my company, my life, and she'd done it so perfectly that I hadn't even questioned it. I'd done the work for her. I'd destroyed Clara myself. I walked out of the house. I didn't yell. I didn't confront Angel. I didn't demand answers. I just left, got in my car, and drove away from everything that had seemed like my life. I drove through the city, past the neighborhoods where I had properties, past the streets where my company's building stood. I drove for hours, watching the familiar landscape transform into something unfamiliar as night fell. Eventually, I found myself in the older part of the city, in the neighborhood where people who'd failed at their dreams lived, where people who'd been pushed out of their lives tried to rebuild something from the wreckage. And I saw her. Clara was walking out of a small school building, and she was holding a child's hand. The boy couldn't have been more than 5 years old. He had her coloring, pale skin, her particular delicate features. But when he looked up at her, his face was full of this absolute certainty that he was loved, that he was safe, that the person holding his hand was someone he could trust completely. I hadn't seen Clara in 6 years. She'd aged, in the way that comes from having lived through something difficult. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her hair was shorter, simpler. She was wearing ordinary clothes, not cheap, but not the carefully curated wardrobe of the woman I had married. She looked like a person who'd had to learn to make her own way in the world. She looked real, and I understood, in that moment, what she'd been trying to tell me in the kitchen all those years ago. She'd been trying to save my mother. She'd discovered something was wrong with the medication, and she'd been trying to fix it. And I'd ejected her from my life before giving her 30 seconds to explain. She looked up then, as if she could feel me watching her. Our eyes met across the parking lot, and I saw her face go through several expressions very quickly. Surprise, pain, something that might have been hope, and then a careful blankness that suggested she'd learned how to protect herself. She turned away and continued walking, holding her son's hand. Moving toward a car that was old and practical and nothing like the vehicles I drove. I stood there and let her go because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't have the right to stop her. I didn't have the right to ask her questions. I didn't have the right to anything from her at all. I went to see my lawyer that night. I told him I wanted to investigate everything, where the medication had come from, who had ordered it, what exactly had been in those bottles that Angel was giving to my mother. I wanted to know the truth, finally, completely, no matter what it revealed about me. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. The medication that Clara had been pouring down the drain was indeed fake. It had been switched out about 6 months into Angel's management of my mother's care. The real medication was being stored somewhere else. I never did find out where, and eventually I realized it didn't matter. The point was that my mother had been deliberately, systematically deprived of the medication she needed. This had been engineered by 2 people, Angel and my brother Roy. The theory, and it was supported by enough circumstantial evidence to believe it, was that they'd planned to get my mother out of the way so that I would become more dependent on Angel's counsel, more vulnerable to being manipulated. Roy apparently thought that if he could control me, he could get his hands on the company, could fix his various financial problems, could rebuild his life on the back of my weakness. He'd underestimated how much I actually liked the company, how deeply I was invested in keeping it strong, how little I could actually be manipulated into giving him what he wanted. But Angel had been smarter. She'd realized that once Roy wasn't useful to her anymore, she could discard him. And she had. She'd married me, she'd gotten pregnant, and the investigation revealed that the child might not be mine, and might not actually have rights as a legal heir to anything important. But she'd tried. What the investigation couldn't prove What I already knew in my bones was that Angel had deliberately poisoned my mother with fake medication, watched her decline, watched her die, and done it all so that she could have a clearer path to me and my money. And I'd helped her. I'd done the hard part for her. I'd destroyed my marriage, ejected my wife from my home, and isolated myself so completely that I had no one left to question my judgment. I went to the police with all of this. I gave them everything I had. But here's the thing about being wealthy. It's very hard to prosecute when you're rich and powerful, and you know good lawyers. Angel hired the best defense attorney money could buy. Roy did the same. They both claimed that any strange medication was a mistake, that they had no idea what I was talking about, that I was a grieving man making wild accusations. The evidence wasn't airtight. Medication can be replaced in a lot of different ways. There was no smoking gun, no confession, no irrefutable proof, and my own credibility was damaged by the fact that I'd been so completely wrong about my wife, that I'd trusted Angel so completely, that I'd been such an easy mark. The case went nowhere. Angel and Roy were never charged with anything, but the marriage was over. Even Angel knew that. Once I understood what she'd done, once I really looked at her, I couldn't see anything but the calculation underneath. She'd been playing a role the entire time, and the role required her to seem devoted, to seem caring. Now that the role was no longer necessary, she couldn't even pretend anymore. She left me. She took a substantial settlement. My lawyers fought hard, but the reality was that she'd been married to me. She was the mother of a child she claimed was mine. The paternity tests were inconclusive because she'd refused to allow them, and she had rights. I gave her what the law said she deserved, and she went to build the next chapter of her life, probably with another wealthy man who wouldn't ask too many questions. My brother ended up in prison, though not for what he'd actually done. He got caught committing fraud in an unrelated business deal, and he's still there as far as I know. It's not the justice he deserved, but it's something. As for me, I spent the next few years trying to understand how I'd become the kind of person who could destroy his marriage based on a moment of misunderstanding, who could be manipulated so completely, who could fail to see the truth even when people were putting it directly in front of him. I didn't like the person I discovered in that examination. I liked him even less when I realized that most of my problems were my own making. I hired investigators to find Clara. It took longer than I would have liked, but eventually they located her. She was living in a small city about 2 hours away, working as a teacher at a private school. She'd used part of her settlement to pay for her education. She'd gotten a degree in childhood development and special education. She was working with children who had learning disabilities, helping them navigate school in a world that hadn't been built with them in mind. She'd also filed all the paperwork to legally adopt her son. He wasn't my biological child. The DNA test I later obtained made that clear. He was the result of a relationship she'd had after the divorce with someone who apparently hadn't stuck around for parenting, but had given her this gift of a child who would never know the shame of being the product of a manipulation. I had her address. I sat on the information for 3 months, trying to figure out what I could possibly say to her, how I could possibly begin to apologize for what I'd done. Then one day, I just showed up. I didn't call ahead. I didn't send a letter. I just drove to her house, a small, neat place in a neighborhood where people had to work for a living, and I knocked on the door. When she answered, her first expression was shock. Her second was the careful blankness that suggested she'd learned to protect herself from the things that had hurt her before. "Hello, Clinton," she said. It was polite. It was distant. It was exactly what I deserved. "I need to talk to you," I said. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but I need you to listen to what I have to say." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider and let me into her life. We sat in her small living room, and I told her everything. I told her about the investigation. I told her about what Angel and Roy had actually been doing. I told her that I'd been wrong, completely and utterly wrong, and that I'd understood this too late to fix it. I told her that I'd spent years coming to terms with the fact that I'd destroyed my marriage to an innocent woman because I'd been too lazy and too comfortable to actually listen to what she was trying to tell me. She listened to all of this without interrupting. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just sat there, this woman I'd married and discarded, and she listened to my confession with the patience of someone who'd already done all the grieving she was going to do. When I finished, she said, "I wasn't naive, Clinton. I know that's what you called me. I know that's what everyone called me. But I wasn't. I was just quiet. I was just someone who'd learned early on that my sister was going to take what she wanted from me no matter what I did, so I might as well not fight it. I was just someone who'd learned that men with power had the ability to destroy you, so I might as well make myself small enough that they wouldn't bother trying." She paused. "I saw what Angel was doing to your mother. I tried to tell you, and when you didn't listen, I made a choice. I chose to fix the problem myself rather than wait for someone else to do it, and I got punished for that. I lost my home, my reputation, my marriage, everything I thought I was building." "I know," I said. "I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am." "But here's the thing," Clara said, and for the first time, there was something in her voice that wasn't measured and careful. "I'm not angry anymore. I was angry for a long time. I was angry that you didn't trust me. I was angry that you made a choice so quickly, without even giving me a chance to explain. I was angry that you were willing to believe the worst about me because it was easier than actually thinking about what was happening." She stood up and walked toward the window. "But I'm not angry anymore because I realized that your anger, your skepticism, your refusal to listen, that wasn't really about me. It was about you. It was about the fact that you didn't want to see me. You wanted to see the story you'd already decided was true about me." "That's true," I said. "That's all true. And once I accepted that, once I understood that your treatment of me said more about you than it did about me, I was able to let it go. I was able to build a life that had nothing to do with you, with your money, with your approval, or your acknowledgement. I got my degree. I found work that matters to me. I had a child. I became a person in my own right, not someone defined by being married to you." She turned back to look at me. "So what do you want from me now, Clinton? What are you here for? Because I can't give you redemption. I can't absolve you of your mistakes. Only you can do that, and only by actually becoming someone worth forgiving." "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know if there's anything I can say or do that would be adequate to this situation. I came here because I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to know that you were right, that you were trying to save my mother, that you were good, and I was wrong about you. But I'm realizing that you don't actually need that from me. You already know who you are." She nodded, and then, to my surprise, she did something unexpected. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile, and it wasn't warm, but it was real. "That's the first decent thing you've said since you arrived." I left her house about an hour later. We talked about her work, about her son, about the things she'd built in her life. I didn't try to apologize again. I didn't try to offer money or help or any of the things that I could provide that might make me feel like I was fixing the problem. I just listened. As I was leaving, she said one more thing. "Your mother did care about you, you know. Even at the end, even when Angel had convinced her that I was some kind of villain, she still loved you. She just wished you'd listened to her." I drove home that night, and I wept. Not the measured, controlled tears of someone processing an emotional moment, but the kind of weeping that comes from your core, from the part of you that understands what you've lost, and knows that you'll never get it back. I've spent the last few years trying to rebuild myself into someone worth being. I've stepped back from day-to-day control of my company and brought in good people who actually cared about more than just profit margins. I've donated most of my excess wealth to education initiatives, particularly programs designed to help people who come from nothing and need support getting ahead. I've also developed a relationship with Clara's son, not as his father, he has a father now, someone who earned the right to that title, but as something else, a mentor, maybe, someone who cares about his well-being without needing anything from him in return. He's a smart kid, curious, kind. He reminds me of Clara, actually. He has that same quality of noticing things, of being aware of what's happening around him. Clara has told me that he has no anger toward me, which somehow makes the guilt worse rather than better. It would be easier if he blamed me. It would be easier if there was someone to fight with, someone to prove myself against. But there isn't. There's just the quiet knowledge that I failed the people I should have protected, that I caused damage that can't be fully repaired, and that the only thing I can do with that knowledge is try not to make the same mistakes again. The house I grew up in, the one where all of this happened, is being turned into a community center. It seemed appropriate somehow, a place where people live their private dramas, their small betrayals, their moments of failing each other. That space felt too weighted with failure to remain as a private residence. Better to open it up, to let it serve a function beyond its original purpose. I don't live there anymore. I have a smaller house now, in a different part of the city. It's still nice, I'm still rich, and I'm still able to provide for myself very comfortably. But it's not excessive. It doesn't require a staff to maintain. It's just a place where I live, where I sometimes have Clara and her son over for dinner, where I try to practice being present with the people in my life instead of distracted by the next thing. I think about my mother often. I think about the fact that she went to her grave believing that her daughter-in-law had betrayed her, that her own judgment had been corrupted by someone else's manipulation. I think about how much pain she suffered unnecessarily, how much of that suffering could have been prevented if I'd just taken 30 seconds to listen to Clara, instead of assuming I already knew the truth. The worst part is that I'll never know if my mother would have eventually learned the truth about Angel and Roy. I'll never know if she would have recanted her judgment of Clara, if she would have asked for forgiveness, if there would have been a moment of reconciliation between them. I'll never know because I prevented that from happening. By acting too quickly, by trusting the wrong person, by refusing to see what was actually in front of me, I closed off all the possibilities. I made choices that couldn't be unmade. And that's what I want people to understand about this story. This isn't a story about a villain getting her comeuppance. This isn't a story about justice being served and everything working out in the end. This is a story about how quickly we can destroy something good if we're not paying attention. How easily we can hurt the people we're supposed to love if we're more interested in a convenient narrative than in the truth. I had everything. I had money, power, status, a beautiful wife, a loving mother, a secure position in the world, and I threw it away because I wasn't willing to listen. I threw it away because I was too comfortable, too distracted, too convinced of my own judgment to actually pay attention to what was happening in my own home. I wasn't a bad man. I still don't think I was a bad man, but I was a careless man, and carelessness in matters of the heart is just another word for cruelty. If you're watching this, if this story has moved you at all, I want you to consider the people in your life who are trying to tell you things that you don't want to hear. I want you to consider the moments when you're dismissing someone's concerns because it's easier than actually engaging with the possibility that you might be wrong. I want you to listen. That's the real lesson of this story. Not that good triumphs in the end, though sometimes it does. Not that secrets are always revealed, though sometimes they are. But simply that the people who love you are trying to tell you things. And if you're not careful, if you're not present, if you're not willing to actually listen, you'll lose them. And some losses can never be recovered. My mother is gone. Those years I could have spent with her, actually present, actually listening to her, those are gone. Clara is building a good life, and I'm genuinely glad about that. But I'll never have the marriage we could have built if I'd handled things differently. These are the consequences of not listening. These are the things I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. All I can do now is try to be better. Try to listen. Try to see the people in front of me instead of seeing the story I've decided is true about them. It's not redemption. Redemption isn't available to me, but it's something. It's the only thing I have left to offer. And maybe that has to be enough. Now I want to ask you something. Because this story isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what happens in all our lives. If you were Clinton, what would you have done differently? If you were in that kitchen with Clara, would you have listened? Or would you have made the same choice I did? And if you were Clara, could you have forgiven him? I want you to comment. Tell me, would you have done what she did, tried to save someone even when it put you at risk? Or would you have stayed silent to protect yourself? This is what I want from you. Your voice, your story, your reflection on what it means to listen to the people we love. Subscribe to Pressify Stories if you haven't already. Turn on that notification bell, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this. We have 100+ stories on this channel. Stories of betrayal, redemption, family, loss, and the complicated ways we hurt and heal each other. Stories that matter. Stories that will make you think about your own life, your own choices, the people you might not be listening to. Check them out, because every one of them has something to teach us about how to be better, how to see more clearly, how to listen before it's too late. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring enough to listen to this story. And thank you for commenting. I read every single one.